I think we've got it solved now. So, quick programming note. This week we're talking about AC coupling and adding energy storage to a grid-dependent existing PV system. Next week, the webinar in the same time slot will be in Espanol, and we will talk about NEC 2017 solutions for the United States and in Puerto Rico in specific. Let's see, and then 2 weeks from now, we're still trying to figure out what the title of that webinar will be, but the topic will be IEEE 2030.5 Communications Standard and the requirements that are being driven by a variety of utilities across the country, but specifically the investor-owned utilities in California are pushing through California Rule 21, Phase 2 compliance. And that requires, for grid interconnection, requires communications with the utility. And we've got a couple of exciting solutions for that. And now screen sharing apparently is paused. So we have a technical problem there we get to go solve. That's excellent news. Let's see if we can't fix that. There we go. Okay, so that's our programming notes, and then without further ado, we'll go into adding energy storage to a grid-dependent inverter. We're going to assume that our audience is familiar with option 2 for adding energy storage to a grid-dependent inverter, and that's simply replacing that grid-dependent inverter with an inverter that's capable of handling the energy storage and keeping the array alive in a grid outage. So we'll talk about in this webinar just option 1, which is using AC coupling. So we'll talk through some of the use cases for that. We'll talk about how that occurs via frequency shift, and then we'll talk about the most important thing as far as I'm aware of with respect to AC coupling, that's generator integration. Okay. So what is AC coupling? That's using an existing grid-dependent inverter to charge your batteries and run loads during an outage. And here's a picture of one of these installs of what that might look like, for example. Okay, so why add batteries? What's the business case for a retrofit? If you're selling this to the homeowner, you know that your existing customers already understand the benefits of solar, so you, the installer, don't have to educate them. You, the installer, already have a relationship with your past customers. You know their names, their contact information, and the customers know what to expect. They know what it's like to do business with you. And then the third and final bullet point to talk about with respect to why add batteries is that existing PV system owners want to have backup. We're seeing an increased outage frequency, increased outage duration, and then we're seeing an increased awareness in the marketplace of battery options and a desire to have them. Okay, this view graphic over here on the right just shows that, you know, customer acquisition is a leading cost for PV installation, and you don't have to pay that if you go back to an existing customer that you've already acquired. So what's your starting point for AC coupling? What does this look like when you first get out there to the site? Well, you'll see the output of the grid-dependent inverter connected to the main panel or the load center, and then the grid-dependent inverter shuts down during the grid outage, because the grid's providing the voltage waveform, and the grid is telling that inverter that it's okay to produce power from the array. And then you have no ability to store energy for when people are home, when electric rates are high. Your solar energy has to be either sold to the grid or curtailed. So when the grid is up and active, and when the sun is out, what does an AC coupling system look like? Well, The output of that grid-dependent inverter is connected to SkyBox, for example's protected load panel, and then that battery is charged from the grid-dependent inverter. All of your surplus PV is saved in the battery, and then when the battery is full, if that's allowed, your surplus PV is then exported to the grid. Okay, when you don't have active PV, i.e. when the sun is set and when time of use rates are higher, for example, then your protected loads are served by battery via SkyBox, and then SkyBox can, if needed and if it's economical, can charge the battery from the grid. Your main panel loads are served by the grid and by SkyBox with an external CT. Okay, during grid outage, when you lose the grid, SkyBox automatically isolates itself, the grid-dependent inverter, and the protected loads from the grid to prevent feedback. So all of the alignment are perfectly safe. Your protected loads are served by your grid-dependent inverter and or by SkyBox, and your main panel is not energized. So SkyBox can charge the battery using any and all surplus power from the grid-dependent inverter. And then, of course, on a dark and stormy night, when you've lost grid and you don't have that grid-dependent inverter producing PV power, SkyBox maintains its automatic isolation from the grid. The grid-dependent inverter and the protected loads they're isolated from the grid. There's no feedback. And then the protected loads are served by SkyBox and the battery. The main panel is still not served. So, Outback power AC coupling advantages. You get frequency walk compatibility, and that allows the grid-dependent inverter to feather back its output under a closed loop control or closed loop feedback mechanism. Okay, so by comparison, and we'll hit these in a couple different ways. If you looked at our Radian product, for example, with frequency shift, so the Radian incrementally steps up the output frequency as the battery reaches full charge. And then you need special Radian firmware update that you have to download from the internet to enable that. And then you program the target battery voltage, the current limit, and your timers. We try to make things a little simpler with SkyBox. We incrementally step up frequency as the battery reaches full charge. And then that's enabled via download from SkyBox firmware, version 1.1415 or later. That's our standard firmware offering. It's available out there from any internet connected SkyBox right now. And then you simply install and set up the battery. How do you know when you're done? Well, you enable remote login and you grab any tablet on your network. Here's an example of this using my tablet, and from the SkyBox, you download the latest 1.4.15 firmware, configure the battery, that's it. And then as a final note, you do want to select your battery configuration or consult your battery manufacturer for their recommendations for how to do that configuration. Technical considerations. So this covers both installation and a fair bit of sales, technical sales with respect to reaching out to your customer base. SkyBox will support up to 7.6 kW of grid-dependent inverter or inverters, if they're microinverters. Okay, that up to 7.6 kW limit can be reached if those grid-dependent inverters can be configured per 1741 UL 1741 SA, can be configured for operation in Hawaii to 14H or California Rule 21. And then you can do that configuration regardless of locality. So you don't have to physically be located in California or Hawaii to do that configuration value on your grid-dependent inverter. Now, if for some reason you're not dealing or you're not able to configure that grid-dependent inverter, as long as this UL1741SA inverter, SkyBox can have the same nameplate capacity as a grid-dependent inverter. So you can have up to 5 kW if you're not configured for operation in California or Hawaii. And then your final technical consideration is your SkyBox should be utilized on grid and internet connected, right? SkyBox can produce 5 kW of power. That's 20 point whatever amps AC at 240 volts or up to 24 volts with voltage sag. So if you're starting a large inductive motor, if you've got a well pump, for example, it may require a lot more current than a single SkyBox can provide. And then finally, you want to be internet connected because that enables remote troubleshooting, email notifications, etc. Okay. Other Outback advantages. We offer the best protection to safeguard the batteries, right? When you do an AC coupling install, your batteries are the largest percentage of that installation, right? So SkyBox and its firmware are designed to protect the batteries. We limit unexpected current during charging stages based on the battery specifications, and we prevent damage once the batteries reach 100% charge. Okay, we offer, again, best protections to safeguard the batteries, best generator protection and control, and then that frequency watt compatibility allows a grid-dependent inverter to feather back its output under a closed loop control. So that's our summary of the advantages. So market considerations, pros and cons of doing AC coupling. Well, AC coupling is incredibly effective for time of use, for load shifting, energy arbitrage. If you've got grid utility costs that vary over the course of the day, adding storage is a great way to improve your ROI from that system and to lower your electric bill. AC coupling provides a new channel of sales for you and the installers. It's easy firmware installation. And finally, that enables, it also enables optimizers, microinverters, and standard inverters to have access to batteries and generators where they didn't have that before. So it makes use of that existing inverter, that existing PV array. It's less disruptive installation. You don't have to spend any time up on the roof. And it's easy to add more PV in the future. You can add AC coupled optimizers, or you can add long strings. Your SkyBox can be AC coupled and DC coupled at the same time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next or subsequent slides. Cons, right? There's always a few downsides to doing things. So two come to mind. One, AC coupling relies on the grid-dependent inverter to ensure zero not export when the grid is active. Let me say that again. When the grid is active, there isn't anything that we can do to control that grid-dependent inverter. So assuming that it's on its existing net metering agreement, it can sell up to its full limit. There's no way that we can curtail that or change that in any way. If we have our own PV and our own battery, of course, we control ourselves and we'll respect non-export for what we're putting out, but there's no way that we can reach in and affect the grid-dependent inverter while the grid is up. And then the second con is that AC coupling is, of course, less efficient for battery charging compared to if you went direct from PV, DC to DC, from that PV array into the battery. So we offer two AC coupling bundles, two pre-bundled systems. You can get a GS4048 or 8048 AC kit. That comes with a not pre-wired, but it comes with a Radian, a load center that you would then wire, a Mate 3S, a GTI relay, and a 30 amp disconnect. Or you can buy a SkyBox. Everything you see that comes in that box is everything you need to do AC coupling with SkyBox. Okay, so for comparison between Radian and SkyBox, a Radian will increase frequency when battery voltage exceeds active charging voltage target by 0.4 volts DC or more, and then it follows the absorber float voltages just like a grid or a generator is charging the battery. And then the AC charge limit, Radian will also increase frequency when the AC charge limit exceeds the AC charge current limit setting. Okay, again, SkyBox, we try to keep it a little simpler. SkyBox will increase frequency when the battery starts to get full. And then we, just like the Radian, will follow the absorbent flow voltages, just as if that AC source is a grid or a generator charging your batteries. Oops, I've done it. Okay, the Radian will continue to raise frequency until the battery voltage and the current limits are within your set limits. Your frequency grid-dependent inverters will then modulate their output as frequency rises, and the output frequency will exceed, when the output frequency exceeds 64.5 hertz, the grid-dependent inverter shuts down. SkyBox will continue to raise frequency until the battery is full, or until the output frequency reaches 66 hertz. And at that point, if you haven't tripped out at 60 point whatever or 64.5 hertz, then something's going on with the grid-dependent inverter and that's not doing what it's supposed to be, because all IEEE 1547 compliant grid-dependent inverters are required to shut down when the frequency reaches 64.5 hertz. So there's plenty of safety buffer there from our point of view. Okay, here's another product comparison. Again, we're comparing Radian to SkyBox. We could, throw other AC coupling solutions on here. But we've got two really good ones and two really good options for you, right? The Radian gives you 7.6 kW of continuous power compared to the SkyBox, which produces 5 kW of continuous power. And again, it can handle, and this is continuous power of the grid-dependent inverter. The SkyBox, if the grid-dependent inverter is 1741 SA, which it should be, and if it's configured for California or Hawaii, it can produce continuous power of up to 7.6 kW. Your maximum battery charge power, your Radian is going to allow all of that power from the grid-dependent inverter to charge the battery, whereas your SkyBox is going to limit that to its internal limits of 5 kW. Maximum cell power, 7.2 kW off of the Radian. It's a 30 amp cell limit. And on the SkyBox, it's 11.5 kW. Now there's an asterisk on there, and there's an asterisk on there for a reason. Your SkyBox can sell to the grid 5 kW from its own DC coupled, its own PV or its own battery. And now this would have to be in the middle of the day when the grid dependent inverter is producing up to its maximum power output. The SkyBox can sell the remainder of whatever is above the loads, whatever that grid dependent inverter, it can sell that back to the grid as well. Both inverters support AC coupling via frequency shift. Both provide volt and amps battery protection. Both do frequency watt curtailing. Radian's not a great solution for time of use without grid charging, whereas SkyBox is definitely the best option available for time of use. Radian gives you an advantage of stacking while supporting AC coupling. You can stack up to 3 Radians while AC coupled, whereas you can't today with SkyBox. Today, single SkyBox only while doing AC coupling. AC and DC coupling on Radian is not advised, whereas SkyBox, of course, it natively still has your PV inputs there, and of course it supports PV, direct current input while it's doing AC coupling. Generator start, both inverters can do that. And then finally, the radiant protects your generator by having an external relay, whereas the SkyBox relays are all built in. Okay, so summary on SkyBox of AC coupling with frequency shift. SkyBox can produce 5 kW of power, so that's 20 amps AC at 240 volts, or up to 24 volts with voltage sag. So it can support older grid tie inverters up to 5 kW nameplate, or it can support up to 7.6 kW of a grid dependent inverter, provided that meets 2018 or later UL 1741 SA requirements and is configured for California or Hawaii. And again, it doesn't have to be physically located in California or Hawaii. We just take advantage of the required ramp rates that are mandated in those two states to have a positive user experience when you have a large grid-dependent inverter connected to your SkyBox. Second bullet down says you get optional external CTs. Those give you additional features. You can do time of use and self-consumption on the whole home. Of course, we don't prevent the grid-dependent inverter from exporting its own surplus PV power, but we can modulate the battery for time of use. And if you have PV connected to your SkyBox directly, we can, of course, modulate that to ensure non-export, for example. Okay. Again, SkyBox supports simultaneous AC and DC coupled solar. So you can sell up to the breaker limit of 48 amps AC back to the grid. That's where on the previous slide, on the previous slide, we're showing 11.5 kW maximum cell power. Okay, and then again, generator support, easy, no additional hardware required. Okay, now would be a perfect time to provide question or to type questions if you haven't been doing that during the course of the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer them. If I don't have the answer to your question, we will take that offline and I'll go get an answer for you. Okay, Brad asks if the meters will show reverse AC output or grid feed. The output from the grid-dependent inverter shows up on the SkyBox as a negative load, Brad. So when you have a grid-dependent output that is greater than your protected loads, SkyBox sees that as a negative number on the loads panel, and then that shows up on your grid output as selling back to the grid from your loads. John asks, how does the 11.5 feedback work again? Let me go back to a graph a few slides back. One more. Okay, to answer John's question about how a SkyBox can sell up to 11.5 kW. So let's see, this would be the condition in which it could do that. So you would be AC coupled with active PV. It would be the middle of the day, and the grid dependent inverter would be producing up to its maximum nameplate. And your loads would be small. And you would have, not shown here, DC coupled PV array to your SkyBox, or you'd have your SkyBox configured for time of use such that the battery should be selling back towards the grid. And I use a specific example of towards the grid because this chart doesn't show a CT on it. Of course, you could have a CT there, but what you could be doing is from SkyBox through to the main panel, you can be selling up to 11.5 kW of total power AC from any or all of the sources that are going into the SkyBox. That includes the grid-dependent inverter, that includes any optional PV that you've got attached to your SkyBox, and that includes your batteries. Steve asks if you can connect multiple grid-dependent inverters to your SkyBox or your Radian. Let's talk Radian first, because the example that you use, Steve, looks like it's a two Sunny Boy 7.7s, for example. So you can take one Sunny Boy and connect it to either a Radian or a SkyBox. If you had two of them, you would need to have two Radians. You couldn't get that job done with two SkyBoxes or three SkyBoxes. It'd be two SkyBoxes today with the current firmware. Now, of course, what you could do, and we've seen this done a couple different times before, is you could AC couple in one of those Sunny Boys, take the other one off the wall and do something else with it, and then move its array, making sure that it's floating, move that PV array from your second now off the wall Sunny Boy and put that into the SkyBox. So that'll certainly address everything you're trying to do there. Craig asks, what is 1741 SA versus 1741? I'm going to go with a layman's explanation rather than diving deep into the technical information on it, just so that I don't misspeak. 1741 SA requires ride-through and requires the inverter to adjust to changes in the grid frequency rather than simply dropping as soon as the grid frequency reaches 60.5 hertz, for example. Stephen asks, what will limit the power to 7.6 kW? The 7.6 kW power limit on SkyBox is achieved by connecting in the inverter and then configuring that grid-dependent inverter to be to comply with California Rule 21 or HECO 1, HECO 2, the 14H requirements. And those requirements tell the grid-dependent inverter that it must ramp back its output as the frequency increases. That's important with SkyBox because it's a 5 kW inverter. If you have more than 5 kW of grid-dependent inverter connected into SkyBox when the grid goes out and when it's producing maximum power, so it's a relatively specific set of conditions I just laid out. But again, we're trying to ensure that we have optimum customer experience here. Under those conditions, if you don't have that very large 7.6 kW grid-dependent inverter, set to do that ride through and that feathering back, then it can, under those conditions, it could produce enough power with no place for it to go that it would trip out the SkyBox. And then it might trip, reset its grid timer. The grid-dependent inverter might trip, reset its grid timer, trip, reset its grid timer over and over again every 5 minutes. And you could argue that there's nothing wrong with that, and you could argue that's a customer education piece. But if I were buying a SkyBox, and I own one, but if I were buying one specifically for AC coupling, I would want a more positive user experience. I would want to have my grid-dependent inverter work flawlessly or relatively flawlessly, and I wouldn't want it to trip out during the middle of the day if there was a grid outage in the middle of the day. So that's why the requirement to keep it programmed for California or Hawaii, and that's why there's that difference in the limits between 5 kW and 7.6 kW. Sydney asks if the SkyBox is compatible with rapid shutdown, for example, NEC 2017, if DC coupled. And the answer is yes, Sydney. We offer NEC 2017 compliant rapid shutdown solutions. You can learn more about those specifically for the FM100, but you can learn more about those in the webinar next week in Espanol. We've got a couple other webinars that are already posted to our website that cover our NEC 2017 solutions. Feel free to reach out to a distributor of your choice to learn more about our offerings there. We're compatible with the IMO Fire Raptor, for example, and we're compatible with some modules or some of the Tigo solutions as well. Richard asks if this PowerPoint presentation can be shared with us. Yes, Richard, you will get this PowerPoint deck sent out to you in the coming days. John asks if SkyBox uses optics like the Radian does. SkyBox does use optics. That's probably the best way to answer that question. Brad asks why we don't AC couple and DC couple on the Radian. We just don't recommend it, Brad, because it's too much potential for unregulated power. It's too much potential for it's all about the user experience. For us, it's too much potential for the user experience to be unpleasant and for too many sources of power going to the battery not being regulated well or not doing what the customer would expect them to do. Stephen asks about frequency shift. Yes, we do frequency shift with both Radian and SkyBox. Craig asks if SkyBox will work well with SolarEdge's grid-tied inverters installed in 2017. The answer is, as far as I know, yes, because those are all UL 1741 compliant. The easiest way to check would be to look up your SolarEdge model number and spec sheet. But we've done that a couple different times with a couple different customers, and yes, that should work. That works perfectly fine. Kale asks if we can run multiple SkyBoxes in parallel. Not germane to this particular webinar, which is focused on AC coupling, but yes, SkyBox supports stacking. Feel free to reach out again to your distributor or to sales at outbackpower.com for more information about how SkyBox, how you can parallel multiple SkyBoxes separate from having them AC coupled. Craig asks if SkyBox can be used to reduce demand charges, and the answer is yes, it can. Now, at the risk of sidetracking this webinar, I'm a bit of an idealist, and I think that there are some pretty sophisticated ways in software that we could do an even better job of reducing demand charges, but we have that capability built into SkyBox today. Aaron asks, how many SkyBoxes can be connected? Is it possible to provide 100 amps of power to a critical loads panel? The short answer to the last part of your question, Aaron, is yes, it is possible. We're not recommending that people stack more than 2 SkyBoxes together today, unless they've done them already and unless they're familiar with how the SkyBox installation goes, and unless they've been trained on the SkyBox. Our technical support team is geared up to support 2 stacks of SkyBox. Now, that being said, we have lots of people who install 3 or more. 3 is the most commonly occurring stack configuration of SkyBox. And we've got one guy who is in the process of putting together a 9 stack of SkyBoxes. Again, that's with a little bit of help and a little bit of coaching, but he's certainly doing more than 100 amps of power to critical loads. Sydney asks for confirmation on the surge rating of the SkyBox inverter, and I'm going to jump to that page, Sydney. The answer is SkyBox can support 20 amps, no surge, and then it can do up to 24 amps AC, but that is with voltage sag. It is still a 5 kW inverter. There is no real concept of surge in this particular topology, this particular design for this inverter. So if you have, for example, well pumps, that are large, if you're living off grid, the Radian is definitely the better inverter for you. Yes, you can have some soft start options, and yes, you should size those loads and check out what the locked amp rotor current requirement is for those well pumps and see if it is compatible. But if you know that you've got large surges, definitely look to the Radian first, SkyBox second. Craig asks if SkyBox will or will not work with a 6 kW grid tie inverter that is UL 1741, but not 1741 SA. I'm going to go with a simple answer to that question, Craig. SkyBox won't work with that particular inverter. Kale asks, maybe a different way, can we back up more than 5 kW by paralleling 2 or more SkyBoxes? Yes, you absolutely can. Again, that's separate from AC coupling today. The way to support stacking multiple SkyBoxes today is to not AC couple them. John asks, how does your SkyBox know when the lithium is fully charged? Because the lithium battery has constant voltage, relatively constant voltage output until the battery is at low SOC. And John, the answer to that is that you can configure SkyBox to support a variety of lithium-ion batteries. We have pull-down options right now to support Simplify and Blue Ion preset configurations, for example. And when you do those, we do an SOC calculation. So we're not looking at just battery voltage. And it looks like that last question from John came in about 5 minutes ago, so we're probably running out of questions. Yeah, looks like we're out of questions. Great. Well, thank you all very much. Again, next week oops, we're getting one. Oh, we're gonna thank you. Well, thank you. I appreciate all of you. We appreciate all of you. Next week, the webinar is in Espanol. Again, that's NEC 2017 Solutions, specific for Puerto Rico. And 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about California Rule 21 Phase 2 and the communication requirements that imposes on all of us and how we can solve those problems. Thank you all very much.